Good morning and welcome to the Managing Brokers webinar on the updates to the new RECBC disclosure forms. My name is Alex Longson and I'm one of the 3 professional standards advisors here at the Real Estate Council of British Columbia. I would like to thank you for your time in joining us for today's webinar. We greatly appreciate your input and expertise as Managing Brokers and look forward to engaging with you throughout the seminar. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're hosting today's webinar from our offices in downtown Vancouver, the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations people. I will now be muting the microphone for a few seconds while we move into the presentation, and we'll stop the video until the questions period of this presentation. Today, I will be providing insight into the changes that have been made to 3 different disclosure forms: the disclosure of representation in trading services, disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties, and the disclosure to sellers of expected remuneration. As well, I'll briefly review a new version of the forms for use when renting residential properties. The new form is going to be called the Disclosure for Residential Tenancies, which combines the disclosure of representation in trading services form and the disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties form into a single form. In this webinar, I'll be providing an overview of what changes have been made, why they've been made, and how this will impact you as Managing Brokers and your licensees. We will also be providing a timeline of the transitional period involved with implementing these 4 new disclosure forms, and looking at one of the new resources from the Real Estate Council that we've developed to assist real estate licensees to use the new revised forms. We encourage participants in today's webinar and ask all participants to submit their questions through the question box on the Zoom webinar platform. In order to stick to the time allotted, we will be answering questions at the end of the webinar, so all content can first be discussed. If I do run out of time and your question is left unanswered, we will follow up with you after the webinar. I would like to begin by telling you a little about why we're introducing these updated versions of the forms and some of the consultation process that we've engaged in to ensure that changes to the forms were responsive to the feedback that we received. As you may recall, in the late summer and fall of 2018, Erin Seeley, the CEO of RECBC, conducted a listening tour with Managing Brokers from around the province. Along with other senior staff members from the Real Estate Council, she met with groups of Managing Brokers in each board region to discuss the new rules and the forms and to hear about the impacts these changes were making on businesses and consumers. The feedback that we heard in those meetings informed the development of the revisions, and that year the members of the Real Estate Council committed to issuing revised versions of the forms. In January 2019, we followed up with a survey of all licensees, asking questions about the ways in which the new disclosure requirements were impacting licensees. And finally, with the help of a third-party market research firm, we conducted focus group testing with consumers to measure how well consumers understood why they were receiving the disclosure forms and how likely they were to read and understand the information the disclosure forms contained. Along the way, we also consulted with experienced Managing Brokers who sit on RECBC's advisory groups, as well as the knowledgeable members of the BCREA Standard Forms Committee. We're grateful to everyone who provided feedback and suggestions to us on the way. I hope that those of you on the call today who had participated in our consultation activities will see that your feedback has been acted upon. Based on all of the results of the information that we gathered, a few themes stood out quite clearly. The forms needed to be streamlined, and the use of technical language, terms like agency and unrepresented party, needed to be reduced whenever possible. Shorter forms that use plain language would be easier to explain, and consumers were more likely to read them. Consumers needed assurances that the forms are not contracts, in order to make them feel more comfortable about, about signing or acknowledging receipt of the forms. Consumers needed more upfront information on why a licensee was presenting them with the form to help them understand that it was not sales related, but rather a regulatory information that the licensee is required to present to them. Finally, revisions were needed to make the forms more relevant to the information needs of prospective tenants, for use by those licensees finding tenants for their clients' residential rental property. Based on all of this feedback, staff from RECBC and the Office of the Superintendent of Real Estate have worked together to revise the forms. Through the revision process, we've also received feedback from expert advisory groups, such as the Trading Services Advisory Group and the Standards Forms Committee, along with the Tenant Track, and I can't remember the acronym for that. It's the Tenant Advisory Centre. The updated version of the forms were launched on our website and on web forms on Monday, September the 30th, 2019. There will be a 3-month transition phase to allow licensees ample time to adapt their practices and to ensure that they are comfortable with using the updated versions. During the transition phase, either the current version of the forms or the updated versions can be used. After December 30th, 2019, only the updated version of the forms can be used. On September 30th, we also launched new interactive online toolkits that bring together all of the RECBC's guidance on how to use the forms. These toolkits replace the videos that were previously available on the RECBC knowledge base that featured staff members explaining the forms. Other content that was available in the knowledge base, such as detailed FAQs, is included in the new toolkits. The toolkits have been designed to be useful for licensees to use on their own and for classroom use as teaching tools by managing brokers. Later in this webinar, we'll take you through one of the toolkits so that you can begin to familiarize yourself with the features it contains. Throughout the transition phase, we will be introducing additional resources to help licensees understand and use the forms effectively with consumers. So please check back frequently as new resources such as new explainer videos and checklists are launched. The goal of all of the forms is, of course, consumer protection. When consumers get timely information about the services to expect from a real estate licensee, the risks that they may face as unrepresented parties, as well as the expected commission amounts, they are more likely to be able to make good decisions in their own best interests about the real estate transactions. Ensuring that consumers get information that they can easily understand and use has been one of our guiding principles throughout the form review process. We expect that these revised forms will be easier for real estate professionals to use with consumers and easier for consumers to understand. We hope you agree. Now let's take a look at each of the forms and some of the changes. This is the updated Disclosure of Representation in Trading Services form. As you can see straight away, it has been reduced in length from 4 pages to 2 pages. A few of the other changes we've introduced include a coloured icon in the top left of each form, which helps licensees to quickly identify the correct form. Each of the updated forms has a unique icon in a different colour. You will note that there is a QR code on each form in the upper right of the form. Consumers can scan that box with their phones and it will link them to the consumer section of the RECBC website where they can access other resources. We will be adding resources to the consumer section of our website regularly. Every form encourages the licensee to give the completed form to the consumer so that the consumer can retain the information and the disclosure. Notwithstanding that, licensees still have an obligation to send a copy of the completed form to their brokerage, and it is up to them how they fulfill this obligation. They may choose, for instance, to take a picture of the completed form with their phone, or to use the RECBC Forms app. We've made wording changes on the forms to eliminate the use of terms that were potentially confusing to some consumers. A good example is the term unrepresented party. Instead of using that term on the form, we're now using the term non-client to help consumers understand that they can receive some services from a real estate professional without being in an agency relationship, but that in that case, the real estate professional will not owe them the fiduciary duties that are owed to a client. On the second page of the form, licensees must indicate the name of their team, if they are in a team, as well as the names of all team members. This was added in recognition of the fact that all team members share the same obligations to a client and thus should be disclosed. In cases where there isn't room for all the team members' names, licensees could choose to use the notes field or to attach a separate page. It is important that licensees who are in a team keep up to date with changes to team members so that when new team members join or members leave a team, the team member information that they are disclosing is accurate. If a licensee is using the RECBC Forms app, they will need to change the team members' names in the settings whenever a person leaves or joins their team to ensure that the correct disclosure is provided to the consumer. Also on the second page of each form, we've introduced a statement by the consumer information fields explaining that the form is not a contract and that by initialing, they are simply acknowledging having received the disclosure. On that topic, instead of a signature, consumers can opt to provide their initials. As on the previous forms, it is completely optional for a consumer to fill this portion of the form. If a consumer declines to initial the form, the real estate professional would use the notes field to document any pertinent information about when and where they provided the disclosure. And of course, they must still return the completed disclosure form to their brokerage, as it does form a brokerage record. This is the updated disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties form. As you can see, it's also been reduced in length from 4 pages to 2. A few of the other changes we've made include the unique icon and the QR code as previously described. This page also recommends that the consumer retain the information. As with all the forms, we've worked hard to reduce any complex language and terminology to make it easier for consumers to understand, including removing references to the term unrepresented party. We have used icons on the forms to highlight key information. A very important message that this form delivers to consumers is to be aware that a licensee who is already representing a client is restricted in the services they can provide to a non-client due to their existing obligation to be loyal to their client and work in their client's interest. As on the previous form, this form requires licensees who are part of a team to disclose the name of their team and the team and the members of all the names of their team members. Because the disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties is specific to a particular property, this form includes a line for licensees to state the property address. Now we'll look at the disclosure to sellers of expected remuneration. Again, we have reduced the form to 2 pages to make it simpler for both consumers and licensees. During our consultations, we heard from licensees that it was onerous to complete an entirely new form for each counteroffer from the buyer. To address that feedback, we've incorporated a chart onto the second page of this form, so it can be used for up to 3 counteroffers. Licensees should, of course, use additional pages as needed if there are more than 3 counteroffers. Consumers are asked to indicate that they've received the information for each counteroffer. Although the rules only stipulate that the disclosure be used for each counteroffer from a buyer, it may be good practice for licensees to also use the form to indicate amounts from a seller's counteroffer. The last of the forms that we were introducing on September 30th, or we introduced on September 30th, is a new form for use only with prospective tenants of residential rental properties. This form fulfills the disclosure requirements under both sections 5-10 and 5-10 of the rules. So it now replaces the disclosure of representation in trading services and the disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties forms, specifically in the residential rental context. For commercial leasing, the two existing forms must still be used appropriately. This residential tenancy disclosure form addresses the unique information needs of prospective residential tenants. So it's not to be used to make the disclosure to landlords, it's just for prospective residential tenants. So let's take a quick look at this form. During the consultations, we received feedback that the disclosure of representation in trading services and the disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties forms were confusing to tenants, as the forms did not seem relevant to their situation or needs. As well, since residential tenants are in almost 100% of cases unrepresented, it meant that they needed to receive both forms. Recognizing this, we've consolidated the two forms and revised them significantly. Instead of pointing out that the licensee cannot advise them on about what to include in an offer, the form uses the term tenancy agreement. It is intended to make clear to the consumer that the licensee represents the interests of the property owner. This form also now includes a recommendation that tenants contact the BC Residential Tenancy Branch or the Tenants Resource and Advisory Centre, TRAC, that's the acronym I couldn't remember a minute ago, for more information. While the form still includes a recommendation that the consumer obtain independent professional advice, as this is a required part of the disclosure, the addition of this information recognises that these two organisations are the two main sources of advice for tenants in BC. Before moving on, remember that all disclosure forms are to be kept as brokerage records and may be required to be inspected. This includes disclosures relating to unsuccessful listings and buyer presentations. All landlord and tenant applications, collapsed deals, and any consultation services. I am now handing over to my colleague August Lamb, our digital communication specialist, who will, far better than me, be able to describe and explain the new forms toolkit and how to use it. There will be a brief pause while we mute the microphone and set up for August to demonstrate the new toolkit.
Once again, my name's August Lamb. I'm a digital communication specialist. Let me get back to the beginning of the page here. You'll be able to find these guides actually on our website. There's a specific page actually for the mandatory disclosure form guides. We really designed this so that you could actually utilize these guides in the field. They actually resize to mobile device screens, whether or not you're on your cell phone, your tablet, or your computer at the workplace. It will actually navigate very easily. You can swipe, use all those kind of features. We designed them in a way so that it actually walks you step by step through the actual form. And I'm going to hit resume guide, but before it was start guide here, as you probably saw when I didn't have audio. And what I was explaining was that the left-hand side, there's actually a menu bar. So say I've been using this form for quite some time, and really I just want to jump to a particular section because I need to check on something. These are hot links that actually you can click to different parts of the guide. We can scroll through, however, and on a phone I would be swiping up. And it talks a bit about the disclosure, discusses what happened in 2016 with the independent advisory group of experts, and then goes on to talk about how this particular form was released in 2018. Clicking here allows me to go forward to the next section. And I can download the form. All the links that I need are here. You can see a hot link here where it says RECBC forms that goes to our forms page directly to our website here on this link, and actually the RECBC forms app. So say you're using a tablet and you're actually on the guide and you need to get to the forms app, you can click here right away. You might be dealing with a consumer and you can walk them through the form at that point. You'll see here, we're kind of back close to where I just started again. It's an image of the actual form itself. You'll see that there's an icon here now. All the different forms have a different colored icon and a different shape. It makes it a lot easier for you to actually recognize which form you've got. And the new piece that I was talking about earlier is this QR code. So this QR code is really beneficial when you're dealing with a consumer and they may not understand why you're providing them with this form. They've never seen it before. If they use their mobile device, they can actually scan that code and it will actually bring them to a landing page that's dedicated to consumers regarding these mandatory disclosure forms. And it really explains the intent and why you're doing it and why they're receiving this. So that's a really helpful tool when you're in the field and you need to have some quick explanation and allow them to have more materials to kind of figure out, why am I receiving this particular form? You can scroll through, click on page 2. You'll see here that the new page has a slightly different layout and the consumer acknowledgement. This is not a contract. That section is there. If I keep scrolling down, it gets me to the definition of terms section. Like I said, if I know everything on here and I just want to jump to a particular section, I can navigate at any time, but I'm just going to continue scrolling. And these are terms that are in particular of interest to this particular form. So terms you've probably seen before. Trading service is a good definition. So we can move on. Great especially if you've got a new real estate professional working with you and they need a quick review. Really good to point them to these guides. So the making the disclosure section really talks about the purpose of the form and really the intent behind why this form was released. You'll notice here there's a big call out, talks about it, and you can actually link back once again to the particular form if I need to get there. We've outlined an exemption here when you don't need to provide this during an open house situation where, it's just general factual responses. So we've indicated that. And then there's a section that really just talks about the role that you're taking and when must you make this disclosure. So if I'm providing trading services, the trading services tab shows me that if I'm, doing any of these listed items, aside from just having an open house, hosting an open house with general factual responses, that's all I need to do. However, if I'm, providing rental property management services, for residential rentals, we've got a new form now. So we would provide the disclosure of residential tenancies at that point. However, for commercial leasing, we would continue to provide this form and as well as any other forms as needed. Strata management services, don't need to make this disclosure. So this is just a clear way of showing, the kinds of services that you're providing and when this form is in particular is applicable. Alex mentioned client versus non-client and removing some of these terms like unrepresented party. And so this section really is just to kind of highlight that piece in terms of what it means as a client. It's interactive. You can click it. It shows a little bit of a definition. You can continue to explore the non-client and you can compare the two as necessary. And it's just a different way of actually accessing the information. You'll see here, there's a little bit of a takeaway about the form and why it's important. And we have Bruce McCovery here, one of our professional standards advisors, giving a little bit of a quote on the importance of this particular disclosure. The next section really is about exploring the form, and you'll notice these pins pop up, and it's really just highlighting the different areas. Depending on what device you are, you can click on the particular pin. It'll talk about that particular section. You can advance to the next pins by clicking, as I talked about the QR code earlier. That's just calling it out here. Part 2, these are information fields to be filled out by you and so forth. I know Alex talked about team name and the members, so you'd absolutely put the team name if you have one and any and all of the members of your team here. You notice that it continues to talk about the notes field. So should the consumer decide that they don't want to initial the form, you can document the time, date, location, circumstances, and put that information there. And once again, calling out, here's the consumer acknowledgement area. It's not a contract, not required in terms of the consumer initialing it. However, you can document that you've provided it. Moving on, steps to use the form, just a general preamble about the particular trading services form and why it's required. And then, of course, different steps 1 to 4. So obviously when using the form, we'd want to discuss the form with the consumer, introduce it to them, show them the QR code, let them have a moment to read the first page. That's really catered to them. Step 2, for yourself or your real estate professionals in the field, completing the mandatory information fields, whether or not it's on the paper or in the Forms app. And inviting the consumer to initial the form or acknowledge that they've received it. Once again, we're just inviting them. It's not a requirement. And then finally, giving the form to the consumer and submitting a copy to your brokerage. So you absolutely can take an image of it with your cell phone, scan it, do what works for you to get a copy to your brokerage so that you're storing it. And here we note that you don't actually need to send us a copy. RECBC does not need to receive this form at this time unless it's specifically requested. So it continues to walk you through. You can rerun the steps as necessary, but it goes to the frequently asked questions. And so we've tried to put some questions here where they kind of explain the general use cases and some of the different scenarios that you might experience in the field. And it can kind of help answer some of those questions. You'll notice number 2 is really talking about real estate professionals and whether or not they need to provide the disclosure of representation and trading services form to consumers at an open house. And so the answer is not the same depending on the situation. For people who just need to read the information, we've written out the information here, including hot links to the sections of the Rule 510 and 510.1. However, something new in this particular format is that we've actually created an interactive video module. So if someone wants to explore this a little bit more, they can play that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually play this for you and just so that you can experience what. So it starts opening with the question, do real estate professionals need to provide the disclosure of representation in trading services form to consumers at an open house? And I can click to continue. Open houses and the disclosure of representation in trading services form. Jimmy is holding an open house. He's put a lot of effort in to ensure everything is just right. He has information about the property available and copies of the mandatory disclosure forms on hand. Attendance is good and people are interested in the property. Jimmy's hopeful that he'll have a buyer for his client soon. Ben, one of the consumers attending the open house, has a conversation with Jimmy and asks him some general questions about the size of the property. At this point, does Jimmy need to provide the disclosure of representation in trading services form to Ben? So as you can see, the module actually illustrates the scenario, what's transpired at this point, and then allows it to be interactive. So I'm going to go here and incorrectly say yes. It gives me feedback, tells me that that's the incorrect response. I do not need to give this form at this point. And then if I click to continue, it'll actually explain more about that. Jimmy does not need to provide this form at this time. Real estate professionals may host open houses or provide general factual responses to questions without providing the disclosure of representation in trading services form unless they receive or solicit confidential information, such as the consumer's motivations or financial qualifications as part of these activities. If a consumer approaches you at an open house and asks you general questions about the property, you can answer those questions. Fatima, another consumer visiting the open house, approaches Jimmy. So you'll notice that in this case here, it's actually provided a slightly different scenario. It's still an open house, but you'll notice that in the chat bubbles.
Does Jimmy need to provide the disclosure of representation in trading services form to Fatima?
Fatima's provided a little bit more information, and then it continues to ask whether or not we need to provide the form. So I'm going to say yes this time because we've got some financial information and some motivation there. And it says, of course, that I'm correct and that I can click continue, and it'll explain why.
Jimmy needs to provide the form before continuing the conversation with Fatima. Jimmy happens to have his tablet with him, so he uses the RECBC Forms app to walk Fatima through the form. If you find yourself getting into a discussion of a consumer's motivations or financial qualifications at an open house, you must pause the discussion and provide the disclosure of representation in trading services form, and, if appropriate, the disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties form, as required under sections 510 and 510.1 of the rules. The goal is to be frank and upfront as possible with consumers by proactively disclosing at the earliest opportunity that you are acting for the seller and obliged to share with the seller any confidential information provided to you by other consumers who are not your clients.
And so that ends the quick module. These are one of the pieces that we're going to continue to update the forms with. So we'll go through the different forms and find different scenarios and create rich content this way to help illustrate some of these points. At the end of this form, you can just basically finish it. There's actually 11 FAQ questions here to explore. But like I said, anyone using this in the field can jump to any of these sections as needed, depending on how much time they've got at that moment. So that kind of concludes my presentation of one of these guides. You can find these, like I said, on our website at www.recbc.ca. And I will mute the microphone and stop sharing and pass it back to Alex.
Thank you, August. We hope that you found the content and discussion helpful for your role as a managing broker. I'm now going to move on to answering any questions that we've received. Can I first ask that if you're going to ask a question, please do it through the chat function rather than raise your hand. We've got a separate moderator who's looking at the questions and feeding them onto me through the chat function. So I'm going to be looking at my screen as well as you. So, okay, I had a few questions that were sent to us prior to the webinar. And it was, first one, can you confirm if the new disclosure for residential tenancies form is the only form required when handling a new residential lease or tenancy? Yes, it is the only form. It's now going to replace the disclosure of representation in trading services and the disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties form. Okay, Is there going to be some differentiation to the timing that forms are supplied to a prospective tenant versus a purchaser and the timeline on presenting those forms? At the moment, when calls are received to our office responding to a posted ad, we must ensure that consumers have seen and understood both disclosure forms before we can even ask them what they're looking for. The answer is there is no difference in timing. The forms have changed, but the rules are still exactly the same as they were before. So whatever you're doing before in regards to making the disclosure prior to receiving confidential information or motivation from either a prospective tenant or a purchaser, you're still required to make those disclosures at the same time as you used to. What is the definition of a consumer? Simple answer to that, it's anybody that you meet in relation to advertising rental real estate. When you're advertising real estate, whether it be a buyer, a seller, a potential tenant, potential landlord, they're all consumers. The question about the name being optional for the consumer when the form is provided to them, and the question is, if the name is not provided by the consumer on the form and they don't initial it or sign it, then what's the point of the form? Because there's no traceability back to the broker for the brokerage. The answer to that question is, of course, because the rules can only regulate the licensees. The rules cannot be prescriptive to the members of the public that they have to sign a specific form. So that's actually why it's optional for a consumer to complete the last section. In the event that a consumer doesn't choose to complete the last section, the licensee would just put in, I provided the form, it was at an open house, 2 o'clock, Thursday afternoon, September the 16th, whatever day it happens to be, lady wearing a red coat. That would be how you can identify in the future that you made a disclosure to a specific person. Okay, let's have a look at this one. On the not a client know the risks form, where it states the things a real estate professional may only do, particularly where it states saying that they may provide standard real estate forms and fill them out. Question is, how can a licensee fill out a contract of purchase and sale on behalf of an unrepresented buyer, including timelines, dates, and conditions, without advising the buyer? This would then create a dangerous slope towards implied agency. It's an interesting question because as a listing agent, you are able to help that non-client complete the contract, but you don't make any recommendations as to what clauses go in there. You may have standard clauses that you know, for example, if you're assisting a buyer in buying strata property, you would likely recommend a clause that they review all strata documents prior to sublet removal. Well, you wouldn't make that recommendation to a non-client because that would be potentially contrary to your seller client's best interests. You would provide them the form and say, what clauses would you like in there? You've already identified to them that there's a risk, that they should seek independent professional advice. They've chosen to be unrepresented. You can assist them in filling out the contract, but you can't make any recommendations on what clauses to fill in there, unless you previously had a conversation with your client, the seller, that you get authorization from your client to recommend to the buyer to put a specific clause in. For example, it may be in your seller's best interests that there is a clause in there that it is subject to financing or suitable financing. That will be in the best interest of your seller. Your seller client has said, yes, you can put that clause in the contract. So it's more of the authorization side from your seller client before you can actually make any recommendations for the clause. Question here actually is more of a statement, and I will just cover it. Unfortunately, I have had consumers extremely upset with me because we've had the top, because we have had, and this is a statement, we have had the top 3 agents in the area meet with us already. We gave them confidential information. They advised us that what we should do to prepare to sell our home and what to list it for. None of them even mentioned anything about this form. That would be something, if one of those consumers called any of the professional standards advisors, we would probably point them towards the compliance department to file a complaint. Anytime a licensee is meeting with a buyer or they receive confidential information or motivation, they have to go through these forms. It's a mandatory requirement. Okay, I do have 2 questions now popped up on the screen. Is there a list of forms that must be provided to a brokerage by a licensee? The answer is all of them. Any form any disclosure form that you provide to a member of the public, you must provide back to your brokerage. Best way to do that is to use the RECBC Forms app. If you don't do that, as August has previously described, you can take a photo with your phone, whether it's in like a JPEG or some phones you can actually download an app and scan it automatically to PDF and then just email it to your brokerage. But whatever method you use, you provide a copy to the consumer and you provide a copy to your brokerage. Another question here. Do we have a mandatory form for rental property management when our client is the tenant and not the landlord? Shall I just use the disclosure of representation in trading services form? Well, of course, the first thing is the only people that can represent a tenant are trading service licensees. A licensee licensed for rental property management can never represent a tenant. But if a trading service licensee was to represent a tenant, whether it be residential or commercial, then they would use the disclosure of representation in trading services form. And I think they're the only questions that have come through. I've got two more coming, actually. Can you go over exactly what is required from a property manager when renting a property, which form? I will go over it briefly here. I didn't explain, there is a separate webinar next week, next Wednesday. I'm looking at my colleague, the 9th, just to cover the requirements for that form. But recognizing that many managing brokers are licensed in all three categories, I've also covered them here as well. So when a rental property manager renting a property, the form that they use would be the disclosure for residential tenancies form. Question, where do we get a copy of this presentation and the video that was shown to our agents? Thanks for this webinar. You're welcome. The answer to that is the presentation and the video will be posted in our knowledge base shortly. I'm not going to put my colleagues on the spot right now, but shortly, keep checking back. So you can certainly use this webinar and the presentation with your agents in due course. And do I have any more questions? I have another one on its way. Bear with me. Is the toolkit available for distribution? The toolkit is actually linked directly from the front page of our website at the moment. So when you go onto our website, the first thing you'll see is a banner across probably about an inch down from the top of the screen. It's quite a large banner, new disclosure forms, everything here. Click on there and that will take you to an introductional video from Erin Seeley, our CEO, and then links to each of the 4 guides for each of the forms. So rather than it being available for distribution, it's right there on our website. Do I have anything else? One more question. Looks like I've got about 3 minutes left, so hopefully you all found the presentation useful. I certainly thank my 2 colleagues today and everybody in the back room who prepared the presentation and everything for me to make my life easy. Can you please clarify if a licensed rental property manager can lease commercial property? Yes, there is there's no separate license for commercial or residential rentals. What I can certainly do, there was actually a report from council, and I think it was in something like 2009, where we actually did it was on the front page of the report from council that said basically, is there a difference between commercial leasing and residential rentals? And the answer is no. So a rental property manager can certainly do commercial rentals, and a trading service licensee who does commercial leasing can certainly do residential tenant placement And I covered that in a separate video, which was released earlier this year. So you can go back to our knowledge base to look at that one if you have any more questions on that. Oh, there is one more. Is there a mandatory time limit when a licensee has to get a DORTS form sent to the brokerage within 24 hours or other? There isn't a mandatory time limit, but of course, along with all of your other documents that you're going to be collecting during a trade in real estate or a presentation or anything else, we expect the brokerage to keep that information. So it's probably more of a brokerage policy that you may want to instigate as managing brokers as to how long you expect, or how short a period of time you expect your licensees to get you all of these forms back to the brokerage. And of course, unfortunately, I've got to put it back on you to create the policy and the procedure on how you as managing brokers are going to be collecting and keeping those records at your brokerage. Do I have any? No, that's it. And that's perfect timing because it is 11 o'clock now. So I am just going to thank you for your time today. I have one more screen, I think. Oh, I thought I had a, oh, my apologies here. Let's just go back to this. Sorry, my apologies. Here we go. Bit of technical difficulties going on. Let's just very quickly whiz through all of here. I thought I had a social media screen on the presentation. I obviously didn't. My apologies. We do have social media with links to Facebook and Twitter directly from our website. So you're welcome to connect with us there. Or if you have further questions, if they are specific to the professional standards advisors, you can contact myself, Bruce McCoubrey, or Marty Douglas through the advisor email address, which is advisor@recbc.ca. And that is it. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.